Monday, November 5th, 2012. This is Spingola Speaks, and this is Deanna Spingola. I'm going to share some selections from the Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever, 1933, by Udo Walendy. This book is available from the Barnes Review. Now, as I go through these principles here in this booklet, I want you to keep them in mind and relate them to what is going on in our country. The same thing is happening. It is just under different circumstances. According to the 21st law governing the amendment of the criminal law of the German Criminal Code, Section 40, which was implemented in 1985, German nationals, including the 18 million refugees who dared to describe East Prussia, Pomerania, East Brandenburg, Silesia, and Sudeten, or West Prussia as legitimate German territories, and who called the expulsion of millions of people a violation of international law and an immense injustice by any standard, will at once be silenced with arguments such as fascist, get out, revengist, militarist, war criminal, or worse. Now, within this law, there are sharp criticisms about equating or denying or minimizing the crimes against the Jews with other crimes. It demanded that these crimes could not be compared. However, 3,280,000 Germans died under the most bestial circumstances during this expulsion. Now remember, expulsions are carried out by governments, by weather conditions, by all kinds of things. Now, this is, getting back to the text, this has been substantiated beyond a doubt as a historical fact, and we are expected not to equate these crimes with certain other alleged crimes of which judicial notice is usually taken by German courts and which to question is considered an indictable offense. Now, in the Communist East, anyone denying or refuting Germany's sole responsibility for the war, insisting that an impartial investigation be carried out, would have been incarcerated long ago for instigation to boycott. According to Western Democrats, always purporting tolerance, such a man is likely to be ranked amongst the people who are always thinking of yesterday, or hate mongers, or Judenvater, or incorrigibles, or Nazi agitators. In short, these people absolutely unworthy of any discussion, bordering at best on cases of the mentally incapacitated. Although Commander-in-Chief Eisenhower had no idea of political conditions prevailing in Europe, he was nonetheless concerned principally with the annihilation of as many Germans as possible, and he declared at the start of the Ruhr offense, and I quote, "I hope that every German west of the Rhine River and wherever we attack will be destroyed," unquote. The Russian chief propagandist, for that matter, continuously incited the already hateful and politically fanaticized Red Army to kill all Germans, men, women, and children alike, declaring them subhuman. The merciless bombing campaign was aimed at the extermination of the German population, and its victims were mostly women and children. Those Germans opposed to the leadership were denied any opportunity of making peace offers on their own to the Allied leaders. This immense tragedy is nowadays considered liberation, and this perversion of official parlance is generally referred to as the democratic learning process and the expression of political wisdom. These and similar slogans are being churned out day after day all over the world in the media and in parliaments and political panels. This verbiage, created by powerful interest, is being swallowed without any sense of responsibility. How can anybody with such an uncritical attitude be expected to learn from history? To an informed observer, it is a frightening experience to note the amount of recklessness, irresponsibility, and lack of consideration that permeates not only the political life, even that of the large powers in dealing with each other, but also the writing of history. He who no longer finds his way through this confusion of disinformation and outright lies is frightened because of his dependence on job, career, or pension. He can no longer have an opinion of his own, let alone express it in public. He, therefore, continues to be a victim of propaganda and the prevailing system in power. He has to put up with everything that is offered in the field of information. He must suffer his own nation's defamation and mutilation, the vilification of his former comrades in arms who died for their country, the imposition of the burden of guilt to the last generation. He has to accept the brutal expulsion of his people from their homestead, where they had lived for generations without recourse to law and justice. He is even forced to applaud all this as the blessings of liberation, the same way as the revelation indoctrinated into him that in 1945, with the victory of the peace-loving, democratic, and humanitarian forces over the Nazis, the paradise-like state of peace and law, long craved for by mankind, has finally arrived, and that the will of the people has been fulfilled everywhere. Alas, anyone who follows world events, even cursorily, knows how many conflicts, how many wars, how many massacres, and how much injustice and mendacity, how much irresponsible propaganda and agitation has been recorded in the annals of history during the past decades right up to the present, and now neither Germany nor National Socialism has been involved. The causes for this dreadful situation must therefore be found elsewhere. We must be allowed to ask whether or not the leading elite in world politics is still in any position to think clearly, rationally, and free of emotions. The people on our earth would certainly not have the constant fear of impending disaster if objectivity and justice for all were were common for action in the world's capitals. The informed, however, has learned to some extent to look into the future and to analyze current developments. He therefore understands that unilateral and biased criteria and dialectical acrobatics are bound to escalate existing conflicts between nations. He knows that no effort should be spared towards solving political problems and clarifying historical context. The goal should be objective debate, no matter whether certain people like it or not. It is only natural that historical truthfulness, being very influential in world politics, is of extreme importance. We hope that this pamphlet is a contribution towards this end. We do not justify, exaggerate, or minimize, claim, or deny in order to pursue a certain line. We do not balance one crime against another. We try to present facts rather than opinion. A very valuable contribution towards clarifying the German-Jewish relations during the period 1933 through 1945 was provided by the young Jewish author Edwin Black with his book, The Transfer Agreement. His objective analysis and his emotion-free description is refreshing, although, as it seeps through again and again, he appears to be conscious of a certain amount of pressure to which he finds himself exposed by his environment in the States. Dogmatic statements on his part, according to which Hitler, in 1933, intended to conquer Europe, if not even the world, that his 4-year plan proves this, that Hitler promised to rid not only Germany of the Jews, but to cleanse the world as well, and finally that the clouds over the world were darkened with the smoke of incinerated human beings, and killing camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka must therefore be accepted as part and parcel of the study. Not is it very scholarly that E. Black presents as facts Jewish American newspaper yarns from 1933 and thereafter about alleged events in Germany without first taking the trouble to check them for their veracity. Alrighty, we are going to a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Deanna, I'm sharing selections from the Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever, 1933, by Udo Walendy. And Walendy says that although Edwin Black's book is good, it has some truth in it, he is also stating, justifiably so, that Black incorporated a lot of big fat deceptions in this book. For instance, he takes Rabbi Stephen Wise's recurring lie for granted that Hitler declared a war of destruction on Jewry in 1933. And this, although it must have occurred to him as an expert, his own book proves this, that Hitler had to cope with far too many problems in his own country and was absolutely unable to cope with worldwide plans of destruction at the same time. A whole chapter in E. Black's book is indeed headed "The Weapon Hitler Feared." It deals with the historic power of Jewish-led worldwide boycotts. Black ignores the Jewish declaration of war, which occurred in the Daily Express on March 24th. Judea declares war on Germany. While his extensive studies should have made him aware of it, he should have afforded this announcement the importance it deserves. For that matter, he should have mentioned the statement by Henry Morgenthau in 1933, and this is only one chosen from many similar ones. Morgenthau said, and I quote, "Germany must be turned into a wasteland, as happened there during the 30-Year War," unquote. Finally, and regrettably, Edwin Black omits the many and urgent appeals for moderation by representatives of the German Jewry to the international public. And I quote, "To the Embassy of the United States, Berlin, we became aware of the propaganda in your country about alleged cruelties against the Jews in Germany. We therefore consider it our duty, not only in our own interest as German patriots, but also for the sake of truth, to comment on these incidences. Mistreatment and excesses have indeed occurred, and we are far from glossing these over. But this is hardly avoidable in any kind of revolution. We attach great significance to the fact that the authorities, where it was at all possible to interfere, have done so against outrages that have come to our knowledge. In all cases, these deeds were committed by irresponsible elements who kept in hiding. We know that the government and all leading authorities most strongly disapprove of the violations that occurred. But we also feel that now is the time to move away from the irresponsible agitation on the part of the so-called Jewish intellectuals living abroad. These men, most of whom never considered themselves German nationals, but pretended to be champions for those of their own faith, abandoned them at a critical time and fled the country. They lost, therefore, the right to speak out on German Jewish affairs. The accusations with which they are hurling from their safe hiding places are injurious to Germany and German Jews. Their reports are vastly exaggerated. We ask the U.S. Embassy to forward this letter to the U.S. without delay, and we are accepting full responsibility for its content. Since we know that a large-scale propaganda campaign is to be launched next Monday, we would appreciate if the American public be informed of this letter by that date. And these are from the Jews in Germany, a group of Jews in Germany. A worldwide message to veterans of the same date says, and I quote, the atrocity propaganda is lying. The originators are politically and economically motivated. The same Jewish writers who allow themselves to be misused for this purpose used to scoff at us veterans in earlier years. By raising your voice as honorable soldiers against the unchivalrous and degrading treatment meted out to Germany for the last 14 years, you will most effectively contribute to reassure this country. And these veterans are Jews who fought in World War I on the side of Germany. On March 26, 1933, the Zionist Association of German... Hang on. Wait a minute. Yep, okay. On March 26, 1933, the Zionist Association of Germany sent the following telegram to leading Jews in America, and I quote, "In a declaration transmitted by the Jewish Telegraphers Union to the entire Jewish world press on March 17th, we have already emphatically protested against anti-German propaganda. We have objected to mendacious atrocity reports and reckless sensational news, and we are repeating it today in public. We oppose any attempts to misuse Jewish affairs for the political interest of other states and groups. The defense of the national rights of the Jews and the safeguarding of their economic position cannot and must not be linked in any political actions directed against Germany and the reputation of the Reich." Unquote. The reader will hardly blame the author of the above for writing his message from his own Jewish viewpoint, and that he has selected and assessed the facts which he examines in accordance with his own opinion. For a historian regarding black, this approach is to a subject is not very satisfactory, because political events must be seen in the light that the others too, in this case the Germans, have the same right to fight for their existence. If one wishes to be objective, it just will not do to speak only about Jewish rights having been violated since 1933 without mentioning in this context that the whole German nation had been deprived of its rights. Okay, we're going to a break. Be back in 3 minutes. Welcome back. This is Deanna, and I'm sharing some selections from The Transfer Agreement and The Boycott Fever, 1933 by Udo Walendy. This booklet is available from the Barnes Review. And just let me repeat that one, the last sentence. If one wishes to be objective, and I totally believe that objectivity is essential. If one is to be objective, it just will not do to speak only about Jewish rights having been violated since 1933 without mentioning in this context that the whole German nation had been deprived of its rights. Countless Germans were unemployed, many expropriated or economically ruined. In fact, since 1919, poverty, civil war, and chaos reigned with little hope of survival for many, nor can it be passed over in silence that the conditions prevailing in Germany during that period had been largely influenced by victorious political and economic forces abroad, in particular by those who took advantage of multinational citizenship and who exploited their contacts with international authorities. Germany's surrender in 1918, the subsequent economic blockade, occupation of the Ruhr, the payment of massive reparations and its consequences, which were inflation and large-scale unemployment, the communist riots, etc., all enabled these forces to bring about terrible conditions either from outside of Germany or from within by way of immigration, naturalization, and financing with hard foreign currencies, predominantly dollars. Instituted concurrently was a management policy for essential political, judicial, economic, and journalistic positions which favored primarily not German, but internationally interwoven interests. These were, of course, not always Jewish, but it should not be passed over that at least one of these pressure groups identified itself either as a coherent race, an internationally dispersed people, a religious community of one stock and family, and that this group had common obligations and targets from which it was considered treason to deviate. Dr. Nahum Goldman, for many years president of the World Jewish Congress and the World Zionist Organization, wrote, and I quote, "As president of the largest Jewish organization, I disposed of budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars. I directed thousands of employees, and all this, I emphasize again, not for one particular state, but within the framework of international Jewry," unquote. In his book, My Life as a German Jew, Dr. Nahum Goldman describes the phenomenal rise of German Jewry as follows, and I quote, "German Jewry which found its temporary end during the Nazi period, was one of the most interesting and, for modern Jewish history, most influential centers of European Jewry. During the era of emancipation, in the second half of the 19th and in the early 20th century, it had experienced a meteoric rise. It had fully participated in the rapid industrial rise of Imperial Germany, made a substantial contribution to it, and acquired a renowned position in German economic life. Seen from the economic point of view, no Jewish minority in any other country, not even that in America, could possibly compete with the German Jews. They were involved in large-scale banking, a situation unparalleled elsewhere, and by way of high finance, they had also penetrated German industry. A considerable portion of the wholesale trade was Jewish. They controlled even such branches of industry which is in general not in Jewish hands. Examples are shipping or the electrical industry, and names such as Balin and Rathenau do confirm this statement. I hardly know of any other branch of emancipated Jewry in Europe or the American continent that was as deeply rooted in the general economy as was German Jewry. American Jews of today are absolutely, as well as relatively, richer than the German Jews were at the time. It is true, but even in America, with its unlimited possibilities, the Jews have not succeeded in penetrating into the central spheres of industry: steel, iron, heavy industry, high finance, shipping, as was the case in Germany. Their position in the intellectual life of the country was equally unique. In literature, they were represented by illustrious names. The theater was largely in their hands. The daily press, above all its internationally influential sector, was essentially owned by Jews or controlled by them. As paradoxical as this may sound today, after the Hitler era, I have no hesitation to say that hardly any section of the Jewish people has made such extensive use of the emancipation offered to them in the 19th century as the German Jews. In short, the history of the Jews in Germany from 1870 to 1933 is probably the most glorious rise that has ever been achieved by any branch of the Jewish people. The majority of the German Jews were never fully assimilated and were much more Jewish than the Jews in other West European countries. My work in those years was essentially of a propagandist nature. I was too young and unknown to play a part in the leading circles of Germany, let alone of world Zionism, which was partially controlled from Berlin. Now, this was from the book by Dr. Nahum Goldman. And so he certainly gives a very, very accurate portrayal of the Jews in Germany in 1933. Unfortunately, Nahum Goldman did not mention the real influence of Jews in Germany's political life and administration during the Weimar period. With his $40 to $70 sent to him every month by his American uncle, Nahum Goldman considered himself, during the inflation, one of the highest-earning persons in Germany. Nor was he the only one. This is a starting point to be borne in mind if one wants to understand the situation in Germany at the time. It presented itself as a real shambles for the German people, including the German Jews in the early 30s. May it be noted in this connection that the State of Israel, after its founding in 1948, never granted equal rights of co-determination or even equal nationality rights to foreigners, certainly not to Germans living in Israel. But the 70 million nation of Germans, which in 1933 was fighting for its bare existence, its survival, its right of self-determination, was also entitled to think of its own strength to bring about a change of leadership, and in doing so to eliminate those people from decisive positions who, it thought, were responsible or co-responsible for the nationwide chaos. The severity of the period of struggle and the memory of a condition which approached that of a civil war during the last years of the Weimar Republic tended also to intensify the reactions after the takeover in 1933, particularly in cases where those who did not respect majority decisions continued to incite from abroad after having left the country. And he's talking about a lot of the Jews who left the country, who had felt sorry for the disenfranchised, expropriated, expelled, slaughtered, and starved Germans in 1919 and 1932, or after 1945. History must not be judged by double standards. It certainly will not do, as was done at the 18th Zionist Congress in Prague in August 1933, to just read off the statistics of jobless Jews, creating an atmosphere of slogans such as never forget, never forgive, without pointing at the general worldwide depression, which was particularly severe in Germany, with 6 million on the dole. The fighting slogans proclaimed by Stephen Wise, president of the American Jewish Congress, at the Second Preparative World Jewish Conference on September 5, 1933, in Geneva, was neither consistent with the facts nor with the policy to maintain peace. He spoke of, and I quote, common enemy of mankind having no other aim than to conquer and destroy, unquote. He added, and I quote, speaking of the Jews, we stand in the front line, in the first row of the trenches, unquote. Stephen Wise did not even refer to Hitler personally, but to the German nation as a whole when he, contrary to the truth, continued, and I quote, put even more simply, shall Jews have any relations whatever, industrial and commercial, with a nation that has declared war against the Jewish people anywhere, unquote. He's a liar. He was a liar. Such agitation is bound to make futile any attempts at understanding between nations. Eventually, it should be possible to arrive at absolute value standards applied to relieve tensions and settle differences, occasionally created by nature, on the basis of equal justice for all. But it is not always the claim of certain people that their rights have priority over those of others, which causes permanent unrest. How true. How are world crises solved rationally and permanently? The historian has the duty and should have the courage to point the finger at such examples of double standards and lies to pave the way for an honest approach to problem solving. Let us compare this kind of dialectic on the part of Stephen Wise. Other names will be mentioned later on with the following report by Nahum Goldman about his friend Dr. Ernst Jack, J-A-C-K-H. Jack was editor of a series of booklets entitled Der Deutsche Krieg. He was a political writer, then director of the, I can't pronounce this, Hochschule für Politik. After Hitler came to power, he directed the Academy for Diplomacy in Berlin. And I quote Jack, I'm quoting, Goldman. Yes, that is who said this, Goldman. Jack, was a true Democrat, a friend of Churchill, who had asked him to come to London to accept the position of General Secretary of a kind of Pan-Europe, which he had founded as a counterpole, so to speak, to Kondolev Kalergi's organization. Jack resigned from his post in Berlin and was subsequently asked to see Hitler. He spoke to me about that several times. He was deeply impressed by Hitler, especially his eyes. Hitler behaved quite normal. There was no shouting or hysteria. Hitler, commenting on his excellent performance at the Academy, asked Jack to retract his application to resign. Jack answered and said, as you see, mein Führer, I am smoothly shaved. If I did not resign from my post, I could no longer shave myself. And he explained to Hitler, in order to shave, I must stand before the mirror. If I fired any Jewish colleagues but remained in office myself, then I would be ashamed to look at my own face. That is why I have to resign. Hitler took this answer quite casually and asked what he could do for him. Jack replied that he had decided to accept a good position in England. He asked Hitler, however, to allow his Jewish colleagues, who were about to be dismissed, a good compensation. Hitler replied, send me a list with the names of those men and indicate the amount of money that should be paid to each. I shall see to it that this will be done. And it was done, unquote. The internationally experienced diplomat and later Undersecretary of State in the German Foreign Office, Ernst von Weizsäcker, wrote about this period, and he said, and I quote, "We were successfully trying to keep Jewish civil servants who wanted to stay in our office, but in cases where the files showed hostility towards National Socialism, nothing could be done." Unquote. Now let us return to Edwin Black. Unfortunately, he does not commence his research with the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference, in which the Committee of Jewish Delegations, composed of a large number of Jewish organizations, as well as the Zionist World Organization and the B'nai B'rith Lodge, had already participated. They represented over 10 million Jews from the large number of countries. One of their targets, crowned with success, was not to allow any absolute national sovereignty. Obviously, they had in mind the sovereignty of Germany. The primary object of the peace conference had been the distribution of the spoils of war. Germany had been forced to accept conditions limiting its sovereignty. Who was it then who started to meddle with foreign affairs? In the German Empire, the Jews had fared very well. There had been no complaints, but rather, according to Nahum Goldman, a phenomenal rise of German Jewry. In 1919, Germany was defenseless. The idea to do away with the sovereignty of states, disregarding the new principles concerning the right of self-determination of people promulgated in Versailles in 1919, and to which quite a number of brand new nations owe their existence, continued to be the main subject of discussion at the World Jewish Conference, founded in 1936. The central question was to remain sovereign was not discussed. Edwin Black begins his book 14 years later, in 1933. He does not examine the conditions under which Hitler took over, the heavy burden of political responsibility, and what really happened to the Jews. Allegations taken from the foreign Jewish press are occasionally quoted but remain unchallenged. On the other hand, he freely calls attention to events, activities, reactions, and ideas of leading men and organizations of Jewry in America, Britain, France, Poland, and other countries, as well as those of the Zionists. It can be seen from this study that there were indeed numerous powerful national Jewish organizations at the time, but a worldwide consolidation of their political aims had not yet been attained. Notwithstanding this fact, there was already a worldwide boycott against Nazi Germany. A World Jewish Economic Conference, the Second World Conference, preparatory World Jewish Conferences, preparatory conferences for the creation of a World Jewish Congress, a Central Jewish Committee, and even, as mentioned before, a declaration of war of world Jewry on Hitler, which was mentioned in the Daily Express, dated March 24th, 1933. And no national Jewish group had ever disassociated itself from this publication. All these activities and organizations, they are so united, always have been since 1860 and before. All these activities and organizations operating across the borders provided a real background for using such an effective power politically on a worldwide basis at a time when Hitler was not even master in his own house. Only the internal disputes regarding policy separated the leaders of different international Jewish organizations from one another and prevented a central engagement of the combined forces of Jewry against Germany from becoming fully effective. Nevertheless, Edwin Black has taken great pains trying to elucidate a very difficult and complex chapter of history which had such a fateful and decisive influence on European developments in the 1930s. The historian cannot help but be impressed by this author's diligent research work for 5 long years on 3 different continents, using a staff of translators and assistants to collect and evaluate the widely dispersed and often inaccessible documents. And when I read his book, The Transfer Agreement, I thought, I wonder who... Oh, okay, be right back in 3 minutes. Stay tuned. Welcome back. This is Deanna, and I'm sharing selections from The Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever in 1933 by Udo Walendy. This booklet is available from the Barnes Review. And as I mentioned before we went to the break, when I read The Transfer Agreement, and I thought, how in heaven's name did Edwin Black spent 5 years on 3 different continents using a staff of translators and assistants to collect and evaluate information. Who paid for that? Or did he just get together pseudonym to work for nothing? Who knows? Anyway, there was an article, the boycott activity in London, 1933. Not only did it last for one day, we often think that the boycott was just temporary. No, it lasted for years. There's a story, the Jewish war veteran story by Gloria R. Moses' son, came out in 1971, confirms the boycott war. Starting in 1933 from the territory of the United States, and illustrates this with the following episode, and I quote, in 1937, the JMV, that's Jewish War Veterans, effected an important breakthrough in community cooperation on the boycott. The influential Jewish labor leader, Sidney Hillman, was prevailed upon by the JWV, by a JWV member, to approach John L. Lewis at the National CIO convention. He detailed to him the dangers of Nazism to the American way of life. Lewis was impressed by the accuracy and scope of the JWV research, which Hillman quoted, and he promised to put the CIO into the fight. True to his word, he got the CIO membership involved in the boycott, and from this, the non-Jewish community, as well as those Jews who were still apathetic, finally became part of the campaign. In Pittsburgh alone, the CIO local sent out 100,000 circulars urging community action on the boycott. Harry Schaefer of Pittsburgh, who was national commander in 1937 and 1938, recalls how even Max Schmeling's victory tour became part of the boycott. When it became known that the proceeds of the tour would go back to Germany, JWV decided to thwart his plans. Schmeling's defeat of Joe Louis had made him a very newsworthy figure, and his boxing exhibitions were sure to bring large gates. He did not figure, however, on the resourcefulness of the JWV leaders in Philadelphia, where the first match was to take place. The match promoters were approached and were told forcefully not only about Nazi atrocities, but about Schmeling's plans to export his proceeds to Germany, whose government was most vocal in its anti-American outburst. It was pointed out that not only would they incur the wrath and ill will of the Jewish community, but that it would be the most unpatriotic act. The promoters were persuaded. The same thing happened in Boston and in other cities, and the tour was finally canceled. Schmeling went back to Germany without any money, thanks to the Jewish war veterans in America. And this is very interesting. The CIO, got to go to our top of the hour 1-minute break. We'll be back after a word from our sponsors. And I don't have a guest today. I am sharing some selections from the Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever, 1933, by Udo Walendy. This booklet is available for $7 from the Barnes Review. The boycott measures, fighting slogans, situation reports, long-term setting of targets on the part of predominantly American Jewish quarters, which Edwin Black describes in his book, are making one thing quite clear. Due to the chaotic political situation prevailing in Germany at the time, and because of her almost total isolation in terms of foreign affairs imposed by the Versailles war powers, Adolf Hitler was hardly in a position throughout 1933 to pursue a policy of expansion. Until the death of Reich's President Paul von Hindenburg in August 1934, he was not even the supreme commander of the armed forces. To antagonize the foreign press by German politics, or to cause prejudice with other countries in their economic relations with Germany, was therefore the very, very last thing Hitler wanted. The victors and co-victors of Versailles, and these included a number of private financial, economic, and journalistic associations, which often surpassed the diplomacy of their respective countries in dexterity and represented the pressure of public opinion, were indeed using all necessary means of power in their hands to impose almost any condition on Germany. And of course he's referring to the Jews. The different governments seemed to be largely content with this situation, and with the exception of Poland, which aspired to exploit the change of power in Berlin for a military invasion into Germany to annex East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, endeavored to maintain peace in Central Europe. In their assessment of the political situation in Germany, Hitler's downfall, rather than his conquest of the world, was generally expected, and this, they thought, was only a matter of time, of a few months at most. But under the protection of these governments, the said private pressure groups, with their worldwide ramifications, were responsible for the gradual escalation of a policy of confrontation of an on an international basis. One of the gang leaders of these pressure groups was Samuel Untermyer, one of the most powerful and influential Jewish leaders in America, and a most successful attorney, government advisor, and president of the non-sectarian Anti-Nazi League. From 1933 to 1939, Samuel Untermyer devoted all of his time and energy to a worldwide boycott of German goods, insisting on rigorous and immediate implementation wherever and however this could be done. This he did right after Hitler had seized power, with no mandate from the German Jews to do so. Stephen Wise, founder and president of the American Jewish Congress, made similar efforts to get this boycott going, but he preferred to have it coordinated with government measures and full powers being given to him by a board of international Jewry operating on a worldwide basis. As a platform for his agitation, he preferred the preparative World Jewish Conferences convening in Geneva, Switzerland, at which he appealed to all those who have joined the fight for freedom and justice for all races, religions, and peoples to carry out this boycott with all their energy. But let me first quote a number of different stages of these endeavors, and this is from E. Black's book. And I quote, "On March 12th, the American Jewish Congress leadership convened a 3-hour session and voted to commence a national program," and this is 1933, "a national program of highly visible protest marches and demonstrations. The focal point of the protest would be a giant anti-Nazi rally, March 27th at Madison Square Garden. History thus records that in an era distinguished by appeasement..." Oops, we got a break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Be back in 3. Sharing some selections from the booklet, the Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever, 1933, by Udo Walendy. This booklet is available from the Barnes Review, and this is from E. Black's book. And I quote, and when I'm talking about the Jewish war veterans, I'm talking about Jews living in America who fought in World War I against Germany. Okay. And I quote, "History thus records that in an era distinguished by appeasement, the Jewish war veterans were the very first anywhere in the world to declare openly their organized resistance to the Nazi regime. They had fought Germany once and would fight again," unquote. Is that not remarkable? Okay. A veterans protest march organized by the JWV, that's the Jewish War Veterans, on March 23rd, 1933, in which the Vice President of the AJC, W.W. Cohn, participated as a parade marshal, unfolded under the banners and placards declaring economic war on Germany. The American Federation of Labor pledged its 3 million members to fight Nazism here and in Germany. British Unionist and Labor Party leaders offered to speak for this boycott movement directed against Germany, while Hitler, in his Reichstag speech of March 23rd, was stressing the necessity of good relationships with foreign countries, and his program concerning foreign politics had even been approved by the Social Democrats. Now keep in mind, he took office on January 30th, 1933, and by March 23rd, 1933, The veterans were dozens of organizations were promoting boycott against Germany. On March 20, the Social Democrats said this, and I quote, March 24th, Reich leaders realized that boycott agitation was accelerating, especially in Great Britain. Placards proclaiming boycott German goods spread infectiously throughout London and were now in the windows of the most exclusive West End shops. Automobiles bannering boycott placards slowly cruised through the retail districts, alerting shoppers. Everywhere, store signs warned German salesmen not to enter. British Catholics had been urged by the Archbishop of Liverpool to join the protest. London's Daily Herald carried an interview with a prominent Jewish leader who admitted, the Jewish leaders are hanging back, but the Jewish people are forcing its leaders on. Already, the boycott has damaged hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of German trade. 55,000 were gathered on March 27, 1933, in and around Madison Square Garden. Supportive rallies were at that moment waiting in Chicago, Washington, San Francisco, Houston, and 7 other American cities. At each supportive rally, thousands huddled around loudspeakers waiting for the Garden event, which would be broadcast live via radio relay to 200 additional cities across the country. At least 1 million Jews were participating nationwide. Perhaps another million Americans of non-Jewish heritage stood with them. Turning to Jewish leaders in Germany and their advocates in America, Wise disqualified their pleas for an end to the protest as panic and terror from those who had failed to fight Nazism before the NSDAP came to power. He vowed that anti-Hitler protests would escalate, even if pseudo-ameliorations appeared. Even if life and human rights are to be safeguarded, there must not be a substitution of the status of serfdom for violence. Such substitution will not satisfy us. The throng interrupted with cheers of encouragement, nor satisfy the aroused conscience of mankind. The crowd offered their own punctuation, as Wise declared, and I quote, every form of economic discrimination is a form of violence. Every racial exclusion is violence. To say that there will be no pogroms is not enough. A dry and bloodless economic pogrom remains violent and forceful. Interesting. Bishop McConnell added that anti-Nazi rallies and protest actions must continue, even if persecutions in Germany temporarily ceased until the Nazis were out of power. Now, Bishop McConnell, let's see, who is that guy? Let me just flip back here and see. Bishop Francis T. McConnell. He was leading the Christian protest at Madison Square Garden. Wonderful. Just wonderful. Get the Christians involved, the same as the Christians are currently involved in decimating Palestine. Excuse me. Let me get a drink here. One reason was that the Madison Square denunciations were heard throughout Germany. De Fuhrer and the NSDAP were termed criminals and barbarians. Germany was accused of rampant tortures and atrocities. As the Nazis saw it, Jewish propaganda was again disabling Germany before she could achieve success, as in World War I. Mass meetings throughout Poland, coordinated to the Congress's rally, had voted to expand the Vilna boycott to all of Poland. The 3 most important Warsaw Jewish commercial organizations, the Central Association of Merchants, the Central Association of Small Tradesmen, and the Central Association of Jewish Artisans, passed binding resolutions to use the most radical means of defense by boycotting German imports. Now, 10% of the Polish population included 10% Jews, and most of them lived in Warsaw. They were pretty much in charge of the government in Poland at that time. In London, almost all Jewish shops in the Whitechapel district were displaying placards denying entry to German salesmen and affirming the anti-Nazi boycott. Teenagers patrol the streets distributing handbills asking shoppers to boycott German goods. Pickets were thrown around East Coast stores carrying German goods, and a steady publicity program was being well received by the U.S. media. So we see here a lot of herd mentality, and we see that the media had complete control and of promoting this horrible, horrible situation. This is amazing. To counteract these increasing boycott measures intensified by atrocity propaganda reports, Hitler insisted that a boycott of Jewish stores be organized by the NSDAP for one day. One day. April 1st, 1933. As he felt that otherwise protests might break out, which would be difficult to curb. But this one day of boycott was only ammunition for further boycott measures against Germany, as well as for further spiteful and unilateral comments on German terrorism. Now, keep in mind, people, he'd only been in since January 30th, 1933. All of international Jewry were going against him, getting all of these other countries to go against him. And here they are trying to fight for self-determination, trying to get back to work, trying to focus on taking care of Germans in Germany, and they had all of this opposition. The German leadership was not only concerned about economic setbacks, but also about the worldwide public feeling favoring military intervention against Germany. Plans for democratic operations of this kind were seriously considered, above all, in Poland and even in Czechoslovakia. When Reichsbank President Hjalmar Schacht arrived in the United States on a goodwill tour in early May 1933 to improve German-American relations, he found himself surrounded by anti-Hitler tumult. On May 10th, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators had assembled to condemn the Reich. I mean, this is amazing. You know, we don't gather together to oppose things as we used to, but the newspaper had the media had the capacity to get all of these people, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators, to condemn the Reich. And now they've got us also brainwashed that we don't do that anymore. We just sit back and watch reality TV or whatever. Hjalmar Schacht then realized that the newspapers would continue to churn out anti-German news that would spread the boycott of German goods even further without any possibility of diplomatic intervention on his part. The message was clear. The anti-Nazi boycott was killing Germany's economy. Schacht went home with empty hands. From January to April 1933, the Reich's exports had dropped by 10%. Meanwhile, Germany's border crisis grew hour by hour. Poland's pro-invasion military hawks found widespread support among a population inflamed by Jewish boycott committees. Events were culminating. The destruction of Hitler's tenuous regime from without or within loomed as the crisis of the hour in Berlin. German officials and corporate leaders had been dispatched to the cities of Europe and America to try to blunt the attack. These efforts were unsuccessful. Government clarifications, token protective decrees, and threats of unrestrained retaliation against German Jews were also unsuccessful. Okay, there was one gentleman, a Zionist by the name of Chaim Arlo Soroff, and it says, as a Zionist, he emphatically intervened in favor of understanding with the National Socialists, certainly in the first place in order to help his people. He paid for his engagement with his life. As early as June 1933, he was assassinated north of Haifa by revisionists. Okay? So they wanted this influential Zionist silenced, so they killed him. And the Jews killed him. Okay? Alrighty, we will be right back in 3 minutes. We're going to a break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. This is Deanna, and I am sharing sharing some selections from the booklet, The Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever, 1933 by Udo Walendy. And this book is available from the Barnes Review. Continuing, stimulated by continual press reports on German atrocities in peacetime, which Schacht had emphatically denied, the boycott protests spread to the large cities of almost every country, and even as far as Argentina and Australia. While predominantly in Britain and the Netherlands, labor unionists and Labor Party leaders supported the boycott movement. As an aside, you know, most of the labor unions were run at that time by Jews. Okay, back to the text. The German fur, textile, and diamond trades were hit particularly hard. In the first quarter of 1933, Germany's vital surplus of export was less than half the 1932 figure. Demands were already being made in the States by John Foster Dulles to have German private and public assets seized in compensation for her debts, thus dissolving German international trade assets. When the Reich could no longer pay its obligations, Germany would be bankrupt. That moment had been technically postponed for years by rationing foreign exchange to only the most important transactions. But with the Reichsbank reserves hit so hard by both the boycott and the depression, there would soon be nothing left to ration. If exports fell too low, Germany as a nation would again be faced with starvation. It had happened just 14 years earlier. It was still fresh in many minds. In the winter of 1919, a besieged Germany was blockaded into submission, starved into defeat. To the Nazis, the anti-German boycott of 1933 was in many ways a reminiscent tactic. There were no enemy ships in the seaways, no hostile divisions at the bridgeheads, but as effective as any blockading frigate or infantryman was this boycott that blocked German goods being sold, blocked foreign exchange from being earned, and blocked the means of survival from entering Germany. How many months could Germany survive once the boycott became global, once commerce was rerouted around Germany? The boycotters adopted a slogan, Germany, and I quote, "Germany will crack this winter." Since the spring, both the Jewish war veterans in New York and the Polish boycott committees in Warsaw had talked of joining forces. On June 3rd, Lord Melchett and the British Trade Unions Congress took the initiative and issued formal invitations to independent boycott committees of the world to assemble in London on June 25th to establish an international boycott council. Melchett titled the Boycott Convention the World Jewish Economic Conference. At about the same time, the World Economic Conference, convened by FDR, was underway in London, but it achieved just the opposite of what it set out to achieve, an economic collaboration of the parties to world trade to remedy the economic crises. A Reich cabinet meeting on June 23, 1933 reported, pessimistic as were the expectations with which the German delegation went to London, they were outdistanced by far. Germany found among all states an attitude that hardly could be worse. On Samuel Untermeyer's recommendation, the World Jewish Economic Conference was postponed to July 20th and relocated to Amsterdam. About 35 countries were to participate. For weeks, they had exchanged experiences, discussed successful boycott ideas, compiled a long list of manufacturers and sellers seeking alternatives for German goods, discussed countermeasures against boycott breakers, and even founded a special boycott publication, the Jewish Economic Forum. The slogan, "Germany will crack this winter," was adopted by the delegates. Samuel Untermeyer's assessment of the situation, and I quote, "He had taken pains to explain to conservative Anglo-Jewish leaders that a de facto popular international boycott already existed. In Poland, it is incredibly good. In Czechoslovakia, fantastically good. In France, in England, fair. In America, very good. Fiery speeches and feisty determination to crack German economic staying power created an impressive spectacle that finally put the world on notice that some element of the Jews was united in the war against the Third Reich." unquote. In Amsterdam, the following resolution was adopted, and I quote, whereas unanimous outcry, protests, and demonstrations of Jews and non-Jews throughout the civilized world against the incredibly inhumane policy toward the Jews in Germany have been unavailing. Whereas the Hitler government has repeatedly expressed its determination to annihilate them economically, to deprive them of their citizenship, and eventually exterminate them, now, therefore, be it resolved that boycotting of German goods, products, and shipping is the only effective weapon for world Jewry and humanity by way of defense and protection of Jewish rights, property, and dignity in Germany. We earnestly urge all of the men and women of the civilized world, irrespective of race or creed, to support and join in this movement against brutal fanaticism and bigotry, and to help lead it to a victorious conclusion, and until the last traces of barbarous persecutions have been eliminated, unquote. May I remind you that Hitler never publicly mentioned the word Jew for the first 6 months. This is all before he even mentioned the word. Be right back in 3 minutes. Welcome back. This is Deanna, and I am sharing some selections from the Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever, 1933, by Udo Walendy. This booklet is available from the Barnes Review. Their website is barnesreview.org. No the before it, just barnesreview.org, and it costs $7. Okay, from Edwin Black continues. The declaration of war officially proclaimed the soldiers of Israel broke up into 3 businesslike commissions. Working with great speed, the conferences unanimously established a new world organization they had promised named. The boycott organizations were the first in every country. Named the World Jewish Economic Federation. It would be headquartered in London with Lord Melchett as its honorary chairman and Untermeyer as its president. But this personal initiative on the part of Lord Melchett and Samuel Untermeyer was thought of as a palace revolution by the traditional Jewish organizations such as the Anglo-Jewish Association, the Dutch Jewish Committee, and considered non-representative. Stephen Wise, as well as Nahum Goldman, both of them being concerned with the organization of the World Jewish Congress, had obviously also personal reasons for taking the coordinated boycott into their own hands, thus discrediting Untermeyer. Their demands were identical in principle, as can be seen from the language adopted at the later World Jewish Congress. There it would be reported in 1936, and I quote, "The boycott organizations were the first in every country to call attention to Germany's plans for economic conquest and military aggression." So this is where all these myths come from, okay? They wanted public opinion against Germany's huge rearmament policy. They alerted it to Germany's economic domination of the weaker southeastern European regions and of certain Latin American countries, which might lead to their political domination by the Third Reich. They pointed out that the dishonest trade methods employed by Germany, of course all of this is a bunch of myths, okay, employed by Germany. At the same time, they carried on an unremitting campaign to enlighten the public through all kinds of mediums about the German atrocities, the persecution of the church, the destruction of the labor organizations, the degradation of women, and the regimentation of education. These people were just without mercy. Okay, we read on. If one reads elsewhere in Black's book that the leading personalities of the World Jewish Congress understood the political if one reads elsewhere in Black's book that the leading personalities of the World Jewish Congress understood the political situation from 1919 to 1939 not as peace but as an armistice, then the verbiage created in this fighting atmosphere, interspersed with so many untrue allegations, becomes understandable. It may be noted that the period of the Weimar Republic is likewise included in this armistice terminology. with no difference made from the years 1933 to 1939. This terminology would find its more precise expression later on in a letter written by Winston Churchill to Joseph Stalin on February 22, 1944, in which he called World War II a 30-year war against German aggression, beginning in 1914. This is just amazing, amazing stuff. In spite of the long-lasting personal quarrels between Stephen Wise, Nahum Goldman, Chaim Weissman, as top representatives of their organizations on one hand, and Samuel Untermyer as ad hoc boycott organizer on the other hand, the boycott had become a fact. It had brought about considerable isolation of Germany and extraordinary losses for the German export trade at a time when the world economic crises caused more than 6 million jobless in Germany, and when Germany could not even begin to keep pace with the additional reparations payments. Without mentioning any figures in this connection, let me just quote an exchange of letters between Dresden Bank and the French bank Société Générale, dated July 1933, which characterizes the general situation and which is prefaced by Edwin Black as follows, and I quote, "Desperate directors of Germany's prestigious Dresden Bank hope to call upon the international banking fraternity for help. In a dramatic written appeal sent in mid-July to a major French bank, the Société Générale, a Dresden bank frantically declared, the atrocity propaganda, harmful to German trade, is based on lies and distortions of facts. Complete tranquility reigns in Germany, and any non-party person on the spot can convince himself that no one is hindered in the lawful pursuit of his private and professional affairs. We would be glad if, in the interest of international trade relations, you would spread the truth and do your utmost to bring about a speedy end of the boycott of German goods." The highly unusual plea provoked an equally unusual response from Société Générale, which had for decades enjoyed cordial professional relations with Dresden Bank. Société Générale response, which ultimately reached the world's newspapers, answered that, on opening our mail, we found an amazing circular from your esteemed bank. We beg to draw your attention to the fact that a French business would never presume to send propaganda material in business correspondence. We are thus compelled to assume that the tactlessness of your letter arises from an inborn lack of taste, and for the systematic persecution of Jews by your government, we know what to believe. We know doctors have been driven from hospitals, lawyers struck off, and shops closed down. Every nation is a master of its own home, and so it is not our business to interfere. Nevertheless, we are free to turn our business sympathies to our friends and not to a nation which claims is destroying individual liberty. We assure you, gentlemen, that we will continue to esteem your bank, but we cannot extend sympathy to Germany in general, for we cannot hide our belief that the National Socialist Party will extend its lust for power to other countries at the first opportunity. You ask us to pass on this circular. Rest assured we will do so, and our answer with it." Unquote. In late July 1933. Now keep in mind, the Germans had done nothing, had absolutely done nothing. The only thing that the Germans had done was to create a safe environment for Jews to live and build, just as was indicated in the first part of these readings. In late July 1933, Reichsbank representatives approached London bankers for an embarrassingly small loan of 40 million Reichsmarks, slightly more than 3 million pounds sterling. This case caused a round of derisive laughter in the London financial community. And of course, we know who runs the London financial community. Investors Review reported in its August 5, 1933 issue, "We have seen a letter written by a financial broker in Berlin that throws a lurid light on the dreadful condition to which Hitlerism has reduced Germany. The writer states that he has been asked by the German Reichsbank itself to negotiate for it a loan of 40 to 50 million marks. That the Reichsbank, formerly perhaps the greatest financial institution on the continent, should have come begging to London for a paltry sum is alarming, so it is not surprising to hear that authoritative opinion is that Hitler will come to a sanguinary end before the new year. And remember, this was 1933. London refused. The U.S. also. Germany could not count on any financial aid from abroad. On August 6th, Samuel Untermyer returned from Amsterdam to New York and greeted his compatriots in a continent-wide radio broadcast which was immediately arranged for him. And he said, and I quote, "I deeply appreciate your enthusiastic greeting on my arrival today, which I quite understand is addressed not to me personally, but to the holy war in the cause of humanity in which we are embarked." With the nation listening, Untermyer explained how the whole world had already made surprising and gratifying progress in the economic war against Nazism. "Each of you, Jew and Gentile alike, who has not already enlisted in the sacred war, should do so now. It is not sufficient that you buy no goods made in Germany. You must refuse to deal with any merchant or shopkeeper who sells any German-made goods or who patronizes German ships. To our shame, there are a few Jews among us, but fortunately only a few, so wanting in dignity and self-respect that they travel on German ships, where they are despised. Their names should be heralded far and wide. They are traitors to our race," unquote. At about the same time, the 18th Zionist Congress convened in Prague from August 21st to September 4th, 1933. Over 10,000 delegates and visitors attended. The Zionist organization constituted a government without country, subdivided into territorial federations from each country, into religious and other associations, political parties, and fractional groups. The League of Nations had granted a quasi-governmental status. Every Jew who paid an amount of money equal to a token biblical shekel, about 25 cents, could vote. The Maipai, the Labor Party, headed by David Ben-Gurion, which represented roughly 44% of the delegates, was considered a moderate branch of Jewry, turned out to be the strongest faction. It nevertheless had to stand hard disputes with the irreconcilably radical revisionists headed by Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was then in Poland, who did not shrink away from political murder of his own people. The assassination of Haim Arlo Sorov, who I spoke about before, a member of the Jewish Agency Executive Committee and one of the most respected Zionists by members of the said radical revisionists, which occurred north of Haifa shortly before the conference on June 16, 1933, particularly accentuated the conflicts at this conference. Arlo Sorov had pleaded for negotiations with Germany to enable the immigration of German Jews and the transfer of German assets to Palestine. In a moving speech, Jabotinsky insisted that all energies be expended to force the Congress to join the boycott movement. "Nothing less than a merciless fight would be acceptable," cried Jabotinsky. "The present Congress is duty-bound to put the Jewish problem in Germany before the entire world. We are conducting a war with murderers. We must destroy them, not only with a boycott, but politically, supporting all existing forces against them to isolate Germany from the civilized world," unquote. While Jabotinsky urged his followers to postpone their personal differences in favor of a war against Nazism, David Ben-Gurion demanded that his supporters do the opposite. He proposed giving the revisionists the choice of pledging allegiance to the Maipai, the controlled organizations with their moderate aims of leaving the Congress. A Maipai controlled presidium finally did prevail. Their spokesman, Nahum Sokolow, had visibly great problems finding the correct words to describe the sentiments of the delegates. He said, and I quote, "It is not our task to influence or criticize the internal developments of the German people, which have bravely suffered through the war and its consequences. We are not gathered here to criticize any one nation or any one state. It is not part of the program. of the Zionist organization to break its shepherd's staff over this or that government state organization, this or that economic system. Our duty is to speak the truth, unquote. But he did not forget to focus on the words of Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, in that he repeated, also without concrete details, what really happened in Germany. And I quote, "The Jews will never forget and will never forgive Germany's insult," unquote. What Jabotinsky was not allowed to say in the conference hall, he postulated during a press conference outside. And he said, 100,000 members of the revisionist movement will exploit all possibilities around the world to carry out the boycott of Germany. He said, "We sympathize with our German brethren, but Hitlerism is a danger to the 16 million Jews all over the world, and the German Jews cannot influence us not to fight our enemy. The enemy must be destroyed." Although he had not, unquote, although he had been excluded from the Zionist Congress, his words were nevertheless propagated by the world press, a factor which certainly did not contribute to the peaceful solution of the problems on hand. Notwithstanding the fact that during the 18th Zionist Congress, the word boycott was avoided, yes, even forbidden, the columns of the world press were filled with a new subject, the Second World Jewish Conference in Geneva, which commenced on September 5, 1933, immediately following the 18th Zionist Congress. Here, the exact opposite was true. And I quote, "Anyone who dared rationalize trading with the enemy was a traitor, and all boycott traitors were to be exposed," unquote. And that is the way they work. They are unified. When it comes right down to it, the Jews unify together, and they do what they're told. 100 delegates in Geneva, coming from 24 countries and led by Stephen Wise, president of the American Jewish Congress, were determined to create a worldwide boycott organization. But this resolution was on a collision course with the Zionist movement. The new callousness generated in the belligerent atmosphere of the Second World Jewish Congress can best be described by the words of the two leading personalities. Naim Goldman said, and I quote, "Therefore, the first task of the conference," urged Goldman, "was to create the organization needed to conduct a bitter, well-planned war against Nazi Germany." Now, all of this occurred in the first 6-7 months after Hitler was made chancellor. He wasn't even in charge of the government. My word, my word, my word. And of course, this is a continuation of World War I, because the Britsies, as our friend Veronica likes to refer to them as, the Britsies really opposed any kind of entrepreneurship. They were afraid of the German competition. They were afraid of Germany's their work ethic. They were afraid of the Germans in principle, because the Brits had learned to work off of the labor of others. Okay, Stephen Wise, who pointed out with reference to the boycott resolution and from E. Black's book, and I quote, "When the Jewish boycott of German goods and wares is to be ended depends not upon the Jewish people, but upon the Nazi government. This instrumentality of moral and economic pressure Jews have been compelled reluctantly to adopt and utilize, but they will not lay this down until such time as the great wrong inflicted upon the German Jews is undone, and the German Jews once again be placed in the status and position which were rightly their own before the accession of the Hitler government," unquote. They basically wanted to dominate politics, the media, the law, the schools, medicine, everything in Germany. Be right back after 3 minutes. Welcome back. This is Deanna, and I have been sharing some selections from The Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Fever, 1933, by Udo Walendy. This booklet is available from the Barnes Review for $7. The Barnes Review website is barnesreview.org. And what Stephen Wise was suggesting, that they totally destroyed the Hitler government. This amounted to nothing less than that Stephen Wise's followers, without a mandate by German Jewry, brazenly demanded that Germany in principle should forget about her right of self-determination in favor of these foreign spokesmen representing world Jewry, that the 1919 status of surrender with virtual civil war situation and economic chaos attained by 1932, he declared a trailblazing legal status in Germany for the years to come, an impossible and irresponsible attitude in terms of world politics. Stephen Wise simply regarded the prevailing situation as a state of war. He looked upon the Jews as being in the first trenches of the front. At the second preparative conference in Geneva in early September 1933, he stated, and I quote, "Once again, the Jewish people is called upon to suffer. For we are the suffering servants of humanity. We are called upon to suffer that humanity and civilization may survive and may endure. We have suffered before. We are the eternal suffering servants of God, of that world history which is world judgment. We do not rebel against the tragic role which we must play if only the nations of the earth may achieve some gain, may profit as a result of our sufferings, may realize in time the enormity of the danger they face in that common enemy of mankind, which has no other aim than to conquer and destroy. We are ready, if only the precious and the beautiful things of life may survive. That is once again the mission of the Jews. We stand on the front lines, in the front row of the trenches." Unquote. Stephen Wise did not present any concrete details concerning his wild accusations against the German government. At least nothing of this kind has been published. There is, however, a striking similarity between this situation and the manner in which the question of war guilt is generally dealt with. Using all available technical and economic means of power, the other side's responsibility for the outbreak of war is simply classified as well-established historical fact recognized by the whole world. Well, that is because the whole world's press said that. And all the people, most of the majority of the world now believe it because, they read it in the newspaper. And we all know that if you read something in the newspaper, then it must be true. Or if you read something on the internet, then it must be true, right? Conclusive details are deliberately ignored, and there is general pretense that everything has been proven a long time ago and that no further evidence is required. The general ignorance and dependence on the broad masses are recklessly exploited. While all kinds of accusations are made, the more rhetoric and crass, the better. Naturally, these accusations are always clothed in words aimed at benefiting mankind and in fighting slogans advocating the complete destruction of the vicious people branded in this manner, thus avoiding all unnecessary debates, critical analysis, and objections. Well, thanks for joining me today, and perhaps we'll share some more of these later on in the week. Anyway, have a great evening, and again, thanks for being with me today, and we'll talk with you tomorrow. Bye-bye.